This is the eLearn podcast. If you're passionate about the future of education, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating the most effective learning outcomes. My name's Laddick. I'm your host, and this show is sponsored by OpenLMS. The eLearn podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in edtech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.in. OpenLMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearn podcast. As you heard, my name is Laddick, but this show is not about me. It is about my guest here, Becky Klein-Collins. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Where do we find you sitting today?
Today I am in the Chicago area, so Midwest. It's a lovely spring day.
I was going to say, I guess, it's the middle of May. One assumes in the Midwest that spring has sprung, although I've been hearing reports of like snow and stuff where I'm from in Colorado. So I don't know, but things are good there. Yeah.
Well, if you're unhappy with the weather, it'll change in a day or two. So that's kind of the way it goes this time of year.
Fantastic. All right. You are with an organization called CAEL. And we had the pleasure of meeting each other what seems like a century ago last November at the CAEL annual conference in Baltimore there. That was fantastic.
That's right.
Give us, set the stage first about yourself and paint the picture about CAEL for people who've never heard about it. What do you focus on and what's your particular expertise?
Right. So CAEL is, it's the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And so our focus is on adult learners. And so really looking at how to help the organizations that support adult learners in their pathways, their on and off ramps between education and employment in particular. And so we, of course, work with colleges and universities to make their programs more accessible for adults and to help them really support adult learner success, but also really work throughout the entire learning ecosystem. So with employers and workforce agencies and communities as a whole, just to really think through the learning and work ecosystem and opportunities for people to use education and training to improve their economic mobility.
And I believe, if I'm not wrong, this is the 50-year anniversary, right?
It is. Wow. So we're having a big 50th year celebration for this year's conference in New Orleans. So really looking forward to that in end of October. So October 30th through November 1st.
Nolans.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
I went there forever ago, but no, I'd love to go back there. This is going to sound like a silly question to start us off with, but break down for me what adult learner means. Simply because, anybody who's graduating from high school, technically an adult, I know.
Yeah,
and we've had this conversation many times before, but I just want to, for somebody who's new coming to the conversation or who really hasn't thought about it, like how does CAEL think about an adult learner? What does that mean?
So that's a great place to start. Typically when you're thinking about it from how do we define this, what an adult learner is, sort of the quick and easy way to do it is to say anyone who's age 25 and older when they're starting a particular educational pursuit. And the reason why, we're focusing on this particular subgroup of students versus, a student that might be going directly from college from high school, is that they're different animals. You're a different person at 25. You're likely, you've got work responsibilities. You may have family responsibilities. You may be financially independent. So over time, people have really started to recognize that those kinds of characteristics are not necessarily attached to a particular age. There are lots of people younger than age 25 who are working full time while trying to go to school, are parenting, right?
Well, that was me. I was one of those. I worked full time through college. So.
Yeah, they're financially independent. They're not living with their parents anymore, and really are juggling life in the same way that historically we've been seeing age 25 and up, right? The other piece is kind of how those learners are viewing themselves, like the identities that they have. So one really helpful distinction, I think, is someone who's going to college right out of high school, maybe going into a residential college situation. If you ask them, about their identity, they will say, I'm a college student, right? Mm-hmm. But someone who is an adult learner, they might have a very different way of viewing who they are as a person. And if you ask them, tell me about yourself, student might not be the first thing they say about themselves. They'll talk about what they do for a living. They'll talk about who, their children, their families. And those are the identities that are their main focus. And they're trying to pursue education and training for a variety of different reasons, but it's not their primary identity as a person. And so that's one other way to sort of, think about this.
I love that you put that. I can't recall recently with other guests if they focused particularly on that identity issue, which I think is a really, really important one, because I'm just, I'm almost a 50-year-old adult. And if I were to say I'm going back to university for some reason, I myself would have to say, hey, you know what? I'm doing this as a side thing, or I'm doing this as, hey, I'm doing this for a reason. It's not because I want, I'm a student anymore, right? Like I have all kinds of other identities. So I really appreciate you putting that out there. I think that's a really important piece of the equation.
And the other, as a corollary to that is, when you're talking with colleges and universities about being more adult serving, one of the things you have to kind of get them to sort of flip their understanding of the relationship between a student and the college or university. Traditionally, a more traditional college or university is going to say, oh, here's our model for delivering education. We've been doing this for 50, 100, 150 years. It's our formula that works. It's what makes us who we are. So this is what we have to offer. And you adult learner, great, we'd love to have you, but you really need to reorganize your life in order to make our model work for you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Right. So that's not an adult-friendly institution. Adult-friendly institution really flips the script on that and says, hey, adult learner, we see who you are at this stage of your life. We see what you're juggling, what your focus is, what your priorities are, that you have lots of different pieces of who you are that are important to you. And we can't ask you to put those aside and reorganize your life for us. So we're going to reorganize higher education to fit who you are at this stage of your life's journey, and recognize that, it's where you are in life is important, and we can't ask you to be anything other than who you are. So that's kind of the difference between an adult serving institution and a non-adult serving institution, sort of how they're viewing sort of how to support their students and meet them where they are.
And I love that they could be one and the same as well, right? Because for the younger person going in, they want you to come out and be the Aggie, the Trojan, to take on the school identity and go through that formula, as you said. But then if you flip the script, it becomes a service institution, right? It's like, how can we serve you to help you achieve your learning outcomes and the goals that you want? But I think you've unwittingly stumbled into exactly what we wanted to talk about here, because one of the decisions, or probably potentially the most important decision that adult learners need to talk about, is in a new report that you have recently done some research on, and CAEL has just published, around how adult learners make choices about how to finance this, either upskilling, reskilling, career change, life change, whatever you want to call it, into education. And so let me let you set the stage there. Before you do that, though, I want to give a shout out to Mastan Safi, who just gave a shout out over on YouTube. If you are listening on LinkedIn or on YouTube or over on our X channel, please feel free to throw a comment in, or if you have a question for Becky, or you'd like to talk about how adults finance their education, love to have those questions as well. But over to you, Becky. How do adult learners finance their education?
Yeah, so the research project that you're talking about is, we did a national survey of adult learners, and then we also then had in-depth conversations with 49, I think, individual adult learners, really digging in on their life histories, and then how do they approach the question of, how do I afford college? How do I pay for it? How am I feeling about it even. It's all very interesting stuff, right? Their perspectives on those kinds of questions are really important. So they're approaching this the way any other college student is approaching this, right? Who's facing this, enormous tuition burden, that, we've gotten to where we are in higher ed because of lots of different factors, related to how much the federal government is supporting higher ed, how much state governments are supporting it. But the upshot is that individual students are really bearing a much higher percentage of the tuition burden nowadays than they did 20, 30 years ago. So it's a challenge for learners of all ages. And, like any other college student, adult learners are going to be kind of juggling different kinds of sources of funding. So they'll be, if they qualify for need-based grants like Pell Grants, that's going to be one piece of it. That doesn't always pay for all of the costs. And so you're going to have to factor in, I don't know, scholarships that might be available or discounts from the institution or adding student loans to the mix, whether you have the appetite for that or not. So, and then looking at personal savings, how else can I do this? What we found, in addition to that juggling, is that a juggling of financial sources, is that adult learners kind of go into this question of, I'm enrolling in higher education. Here's my options for paying for it. But on top of that, they're weighing in all sorts of other factors, like, are classes available when I would have to secure childcare? Do I already have student debt from when I tried this 10 years ago or was, enrolled in some classes? I'm already carrying some debt. Do I want to carry some more? How do I avoid a situation where I'm adding on to this debt that I'm already struggling to repay, right? So those are kinds of the things. Also, they'll look at the course materials that are required for a particular set of courses and look at lab fees and textbook courses. And they may choose courses based on whether open textbooks or free textbooks are available or there aren't lab fees associated with it or something like that. They're also factoring in, is this going to require me to give up some employment opportunity that I might have? For example, seasonal workers are often making a trade-off of, oh, this is my heavy time for work, so I'm going to work now. When my season of work is slower, then I'll ramp up my education. So they're making all those kinds of calculated decisions relating to financial issues, but not necessarily about this funding source versus that funding source, but all these other complex factors. So there's a whole sort of dance around all these different pieces of what their life circumstances are and what's facing them and whether now is the right time for them to pursue education.
As an organization that, you've been around for 50 years and you have the ear of many institutions around the world and especially in the United States, do leaders understand these issues, like from the other side of the coin? I mean, obviously this report is going out there in order to say, hey, look, this is what we learned. But do you also have the sense that leadership or admissions or people who are structuring courses and structuring programs are saying, hey, look, let's put these personas and keep these personas in mind? Or is that still a nice, we want to see that change happen?
So that's a good question. I think there are folks focused within colleges and universities who are looking at how do we reduce the time to degree for certain types of students? How do we make it easier for adults to fit this in around their work lives? But they may not be factoring in that piece with the financial piece of it. So there might not be taking it to that, like, let's look at the whole complexity of issues that adult learners are wrestling with and dealing with. So they may be tackling a piece of those issues, but not sort of really thinking about it holistically. If that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And so is there a way for, or have you heard from through this report, or does the report talk about these adult learners advocating for themselves in that way? Or have they been able to raise their hand, or is it that kind of I don't want to call them silent majority, or it's, is it that kind of bulk of people that are coming in and they want to take these opportunities and they want these options, but they're not sure even how to advocate for themselves?
I think that's a big piece of it. I don't think there is a community of adult learners or a union of adult learners that is working to leverage their voices. There is an organization called Today's Student Coalition that is trying to tap into that a little bit. But for the most part, it's adult learners. Sometimes the idea of imposter syndrome, that's like to the nth degree with adult learners. They're often feeling like they're coming into higher ed, feeling a little bit like a fish out of water, being very aware of how much older they may be from other folks in their courses, even though, we're about 40% of today's undergraduates are adult learners in some way. So, I mean, they are not alone, and yet they are very cognizant of the fact that they are going back to school at a later age than 19 or 20 years old. So I think there's you don't have a bunch of adult learners banding together and saying we're demanding to have self-paced education, but all of those factors are kind of intertwined, right? So when you think about, anytime you look at a survey of adult learners out there, if anyone's surveying adult learners, one of the things that they always ask are, what are your barriers? And it's always coming down to money, right? But money and time. So money and time are always kind of the top two, and they've switched, from survey to survey, they'll switch places, but they're always in the top two. But there are things that institutions do that to address both of those things at once, because they're so intertwined. So like things that, strategies to provide avenues for accelerating through a degree or earning credit for prior learning, or self-paced modularized learning. Those are ostensibly, helping to address either time or money, but invariably both, because time is money for a lot of adult learners, right? So the longer you have to stretch this out by taking 1 or 2 classes a semester with an occasional time off because things get, crazy in your life, the further off you're postponing your ability to earn more money in this next occupation that you're trying to train for. So there's the intertwining of time and money that it makes for it to be particularly fraught for adult learners, but where all these pieces tend to sort of hang together.
It sounds as well. I think I've heard from others, or in other conversations I've had, especially for adult learners, they've either received no advice or bad advice, right? In about how to do this or what to do this. And so does your report talk about that at all? About, for me, as I don't know, anybody who's listening to this, they know I'm a little entrepreneur in that I would any application that came through and the applicant, is above 25 years old, that bing, it would go to a certain person and say, hey, look, we have an advice session for you about how maybe to think differently about college. But talk to me about that. Just like, how does a college reach out, or how does a university reach out to say, here's some of their options, or that's a big problem?
So one of the things that we learned, both like in the survey, but particularly in our interviews with the adult learners, is that we would talk with somebody and they'd sort of explain how they were paying for college. And then they say, oh, and I got to a year into it and I didn't realize I was eligible for Pell. Right. And so, that would have changed everything. I wish I would have known about that 8 years ago or something like that. So you get these kind of heartbreaking stories of, I didn't know. And you dig in deeper on some of those conversations, and, they're either sort of casting back to their first, when they first were enrolled in college, when they, at age 19, and they're remembering, what their options were then. And so they're going based on their memory of what was available to them then, not pursuing whether there was something more, or they're listening to friends and family give them advice on, here's how I afforded it. And so they think that that's what their only option is. A lot of times they'll come to higher ed and, maybe the financial aid office isn't open at a time when they can access them, or the line is too long, the wait time is too long. At some schools, they're understaffed, and so they don't have enough capacity to deal with the demand. Or they don't have, enough avenues or enough outreach to students to sort of explain why it would be to their benefit to talk with an expert on financial aid. So we heard a little bit about, I'm not saying that every, institution is understaffed in their financial aid office, but it was a problem for some of the students that we talked to. So there's that piece of it. And there's also, and one of the things I want to make clear though, is that even if you have the best advice possible, there are a couple things that adult learners are bringing to the conversation that are a little bit different from a traditional age student. One of them is that, if you're working and you're going to school full time, their options for financial aid start to get complicated, or they're not as beneficial as they are if you're able to go to school full time. So like Pell Grants, for example, the formula is really designed to be the most beneficial for someone who is enrolled full time. And if you go to less than full time, you may still be eligible for Pell, but you're not going to get as much value out of it as you would if you're going full time. So there's like one sort of, strike against you. The other piece is that, let's say you're an adult learner and, you had a previous experience with higher education when you were younger, and you're not the person now that you were then, right? We heard a lot of stories about it from adult learners who said, boy, I'm a different person as a student today than I was 10, 15, 20 years ago. I am taking this very seriously. I have much more direction. I know what I want to get out of it. And I know the value of my money, and I want to get, my money's worth out of this. And so they're coming to, the classroom with a very different perspective on themselves as students, and really a much better, over time, they start to recognize that they can be a good student, even if they maybe didn't have as good of experience 10, 15 years ago. And yet they had that experience. And let's say they were at a lower income, and so they were eligible for something like a Pell Grant, or even federally subsidized loans. There are like lifetime limits to what you can tap for there. And you may be coming back to school as an adult having already spent what you're allowed to on Pell or subsidized loans. And so you may not have a lot of options anymore. And so people who are advising adults have to really understand that there may be this history of that is following adults. And they don't have as much access to something like a full Pell Grant opportunity. And then finally, I would say we talked about this already a little bit about student loan debt that they may be bringing with them.
Sure, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And that can play a role in how they're feeling about the financial aid office at any institution, because it may have been at the advisement of a financial aid advisor 10, 15 years ago who said, yeah, it's definitely worth it. Take out this student loan because you're going to be making more money and you'll be able to pay it back, over time. And it's, good rates and things like that. So they may have been either talked into signing up for loans, or they signed up for loans and didn't realize they were signing up for loans or what the terms were. And now they're saddled with this student loan debt. And they've been sort of carrying this with them ever since they, stopped out of school the first time. Mm-hmm. And so when you come to them and say, well, here's your options for, taking on some student loans to pay for this, they're like, I have this already. I'm still carrying this. And you want me to take on more? So we heard from several adult learners who are just like, you know what, I'm not doing that again. So I'm just going to pay as I go. And if that means I have to stop for, a couple terms to earn more money and then come back later, then that's what I'm going to do. So those kinds of insights were eye-opening for us. And, I think it's really important for colleges and universities to understand those kinds of perspectives.
100%. I'm just right. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the person with, a couple of kids and a mortgage, and they're working full time, and then you come to me and say, "Hey, here's another $25,000 in debt to put on top."
Exactly.
I'm going to say no, thank you. You know what I mean? Like, even though that this could be, it's the very, very, um, uh, very confident person, who's willing to take that kind of bet on, this outcome is going to ultimately lead to something like that. Especially, and to think about, we've had other people on the podcast recently who've talked about programs that are, kind of either apprenticeships or, work while you're doing this, or, it's a program that's sponsored by a company, so it takes you directly into the company. These kinds of things, I get really excited about those as well, because obviously there's no guarantee. And we tend to these days couple education with work opportunity, right? And so there's not education for education's sake, but at the same time, if somebody's going to take this kind of investment, they want to say, "Hey, look, how am I going to get a return on it in that way?" So I think that's a really important piece.
Yeah, and and one thing I want to say, I'm kind of painting a bleak picture of this, but on the other hand, you hear these stories from adult learners, and then they say, "But I am determined.
I would say there's got to be
determined to finish, and I'm going to get this done because this is something I have wanted to do for my whole life. I need to do for my career. I'm going to make it happen." And they are finding ways to make it happen. And, a lot of institutions are finding ways to help them make it happen by providing lower cost options, helping to remove some of the fees that may not be, applicable to their learning experience, or, can you provide, free textbooks, or, how can we reduce costs in any way, or find ways for you to accelerate so you get to that finish line a little sooner, so you get to that higher paying job a little sooner.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it earlier too. Two things. One was credit for prior learning, right? That's taking a huge burden off for a lot of people who are coming back after 10 years of experience or 15 years of experience. But also, these are individuals. I love that you shifted our tone here, in that they see it. It's like, look, if I want to become a manager in the company that I love working for, whatever, this is there's a bar that I've got to cross here, and I've got to go, either got to go back to school or get that next degree. If I want to shift in a career and I can see, hey, look, I've been in the service industry, I want to move into the IT profession, something, as one particular scenario, this is one way to do it, etc. So
yeah,
I would think there's a lot of determination and a lot of very, as you say, very, very sort of very conscious choices, and very, very, very go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there were two. There's two scenarios where the outlook is really rosy in terms of financing for adult learners. One is if you are a military veteran, because you have access to, in very, most would have access to the post 9/11 GI Bill, which has, from the conversations that we've had with a few of the veterans in our group that we interviewed, it's a game changer in terms of, not being able to worry, not having to worry about how am I going to pay for this. It's paid for, it's covered. And those students are enormously appreciative of that opportunity that they had from their service, and rightly so. The other situation, the other scenario where it's, I kind of won the lottery, is if your employer is offering a tuition assistance benefit. Not all the time, not everyone can take advantage of it. And one of the challenges that adult learners had with, using their employer tuition assistance programs is sometimes you have to make the expenditure yourself and then take the class and then get reimbursed for it from the employer. So you have to have the money up front. Well, some institutions are helping to navigate those waters a little bit by delaying the invoicing for that learning. When they see that somebody is coming with employer tuition assistance, they can have a different kind of billing process to sort of allow for reimbursement at that later time. And so working with learners that way. But the learners who had access to and were able to tap into that, again, it's like a game changer. So one of the things that, when you're thinking about how to advise adult learners is make sure you understand what's available to you from your employer and ask, because it may be there and you just don't know. And that's, it's often just free money to pay for a college degree. And it makes such a huge difference. And I think some people are wary. I don't want my employer involved in this kind of thing, but the money is money. And so
I was going to say, it's just like,
to take advantage of it.
Just like they say, if you have a 401k matching program, I mean, you do it immediately, right? However much you can afford, because it's
don't
free.
leave the money on the table.
Yeah, right? Don't leave the money. But in the same case as well, I'm thinking of larger organizations I've either worked with or consulted with in the past, where it may not be called an education credit or something. It may be called extended learning or skill development or something like that, where maybe you don't equate that with a college, right? Like, hey, but go talk to someone, a supervisor or something, and don't leave money on the table, right?
Right.
But I think there's a third piece, and I'd love to know if any of your interviewees talk about this, where it's like, my employer has these benefits, but it's like, look, I'm drinking from a fire hose already. And even just, I feel guilty about making the space in my calendar and saying, look, hey, every Wednesday I'm going to be off because I've got 2 classes I've got to take for this. Talk to me about that. Did you hear about that at all?
Did not hear about that. Although in sort of a past life, I was involved with more tuition assistance programs with employers. And one of the, CAEL used to manage a whole tuition assistance management service. And one of the things that we would try to talk with employers about who were offering these programs is how to really support the workers who are interested in this, and provide benefits like, some time off to attend classes, or, recognize when they may need to dial back a little bit to study for finals or prepare a project or something like that, to be a supportive learning environment, as well as providing information about how do I advance in this company by acquiring XYZ skills or this kind of credential, explaining to employees what avenues are open to them for advancement, promotion, more money within that institution, and then provide the support to make that happen in addition to the tuition assistance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Kind of want to round out our conversation here. You've mentioned a bunch of things that institutions are doing in order to support these different financing opportunities, but are there other policy implications that you're seeing happen? Are there other, wholesale changes in institutions? Like, we do this for adult learners, we don't do that for not, for full-time students. Like, talk to me about those types of implications, maybe institution-wide.
Yeah, I mean, some institutions are trying to find, they're recognizing the Pell issue, the federal financial aid issue, and when somebody's coming back to learning and they've exhausted those resources, how can we as an institution, help find additional resources for them? So there'll be like a special scholarship fund that they've created for cases like that, where additional assistance might be needed. I would love it personally from a policy perspective if the federal government could see them as a different type of learner, different from who they were 10, 15 years ago. Can we reset the Pell clock for a certain type of learner who's, even if it's like one scenario is if they're pursuing a degree in some sort of really high demand occupation in a high growth industry that's important to our economy. Can we sort of create a new set of rules to sort of to sweeten the incentives for people to pursue those kinds of careers? Because just resetting the clock for everybody is probably not going to go over with the policymakers. But if you make sort of an economic case for it, if you create a tie to sort of our labor market needs and what employers are needing in the labor market, then maybe there's a case for having a new kind of approach to Pell Grants.
Fantastic.
Yeah. The other piece is, on employer tuition assistance, and this goes for both policymakers and institutions. If they're seeing, institutions can partner with employers around their tuition assistance programs and, create pathways that are easy on ramps for the workers of a particular company to pursue their degrees. And if an employer really treats those monies very strategically and thinking about their internal talent pipelines, those partnerships with educational providers and colleges and universities can really lead to a very dynamic way of building internal talent at a company.
Absolutely. Becky Klein-Collins, you are with CAEL. You have recently put out a report called How They Pay, the Voices of Adult Learners. I'm going to put it up here on the screen. The Voices of Adult Learners on College Affordability and How Institutions Are Responding. Everybody can see right now the website, how they can go download that report right now. Fascinating conversation, an important conversation, especially as we know that percentage of adult learners just continues to grow and they're becoming a more and more important part of the higher education universe. Any final thoughts there? I mean, we're putting your email on the screen for people to reach out to you. Is there going to be a next step to this research, or is this something that you're going to continue at CAEL, or is this a one-off?
I'd like for us to continue this work. We're talking about different other populations that we can zero in on and look at sort of how they're financing their education, but also, I think our work is largely with the institutions that serve adult learners, and elevating these issues and helping to strengthen what they're able to provide in terms of support and advisement within institutions. And we're also connected with several policy organizations who are advocating for greater resources for people who are returning to school after being out of education for a while. What kind of resources can we provide to them to support and ensure their success?
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy day, I'm sure, to speak with us today. I wish you all the best, and I'm offer the opportunity for anybody to reach out to you to learn more.
Thank you.